Great. Well, the future is here. So many of you have been engaged in this area for a couple decades now. When we were younger, we would do single-center trials of 180 patients. Then we were very excited when we moved on to multi-center studies of 1,800 patients. Then there were mega trials, 18,000 patients. But what I'm going to talk today about is what I call giga trials, 180,000 patients, where we can really answer questions much more definitively. I'll also talk about how social media and access to information is really changing the landscape. These are my disclosures. I'm really not talking about any drugs or devices in this talk. Information is becoming open. Microphones have been opened. Everyone has a way to now comment on that information on social media. And this is what I've termed the democratization of medical research and education. I think there's some very good things that come out of this. Overall, I think the good outweighs the perils, but there are some perils that we need to acknowledge and be aware of. I also highlight the fact that in shaping this editorial for JAMA, I asked all my followers on Twitter to help me. Now, JAMA would not let me include, the fact that this was written by people on Twitter, but I did give them an acknowledgement. The world has changed. The Internet 1.0 world was a world where it was a one-way communication, a one-way flow of information. We now have bidirectional flow of information. People are talking back through social media. It's a participatory community. That has really impacted medicine. In the old days, you were a trusted provider. You told the patient in a prescriptive way what was going to be done. The patient was largely uninformed, and we had guidelines. One shoe is meant to fit all patients. But now we have to have a conversation. Patients are better informed. There's much more access to information about their disease state. And rather than using one-size-fits-all guidelines, we've now clearly entered a world of genetics, genomics, metabolomics, where we're having much more personalized approaches to medicine. Media. When I was a kid, there was one show, like the Ed Sullivan Show, broadcast to millions. Now, the problem is you have millions of shows broadcast to one individual. Our job as physicians and educators is to really help patients curate this information, to combat fake news, and really help them digest all that content. Many of us got here by being very competitive, by being the best in our class, but the world has changed. It's moved away from a world of competition more towards a world of cooperation. And when you bring these two forces together, it's what I call co-opetition. It's a new driving force. In the old days, it was Johnny was the brightest kid in class. People were individual players. Your promotion depended upon your first author, senior author papers, and it was publish or perish. But now things have changed where you're assessed, does Johnny play well with others? The physician has now become a team player. Your promotion now depends on your more broad activities, which are collaborative. And really the watchword now is collaborate or perish, particularly in corporatized medicine. Information flow has changed. The copyright laws were developed when we had a printing press, where there were very limited means of distribution. That has changed. Now information's free, it can be stored freely, and we've entered what I've called the copyleft world, which I'll explain in a moment. So things were very insular and secretive in the past. Now they're much more open. People are looking outside their silos to innovate. In the past, there was one guy at the top of the pyramid, and the information all flowed up to them. But now information flows much more horizontally than just vertically. And clearly we've moved from paper to the internet. So textbooks have changed. They're now mostly online. They're continuously updated. 14 years ago, I began a textbook that's now had 2,200 2,200 physicians contribute to it over the years, and it's copyleft. This is a legal doctrine that means anyone can take the content, use it for free, print it for free, distribute it for free, modify it for free. You just have to acknowledge the origin of the content. And it's all accessible on mobile devices. So what happens when you make something open access? You do get, say, 2,200 people participating, 135,000 chapters, millions of edits, 65,000 images that are freely distributed, 16,000 board review questions, and we have 40 to 50 people working full-time on the textbook in Boston. So this is part of the open access movement where you're really lowering the barriers to participation and access. People also want access to data. And this is a piece of work from many, many of the people in this room. Manesh Patel was first author. I was senior author. We talk about a way where we can share data and curate it in a way where investigators from around the world can also access data. Media has changed. There has been a decline in traditional media. Now 2/3 of people get their news from social media. The number of newspaper employees has dropped by 45%. My first job was as a reporter. This makes me very sad. But your ability to reach people is much greater than through social media, and the cost, you can see the cost to reach those people is a fraction of what it was in print. Everyone thinks they're a journalist now. This really was ushered in with the introduction of the cell phone with all the pictures. Photographers are having a rough time because everyone thinks they're a photographer now. But this is good news. I think many of us can now be citizen journalists. For instance, I use Twitter as a way to create a daily newspaper called Above the Fold in Healthcare to reach patients and physicians. We have tremendous reach on social media. Every year I work on World Thrombosis Day, and in that hour, we will reach 127 million impressions. So working with the CDC, working with the AHA, major organizations, when you pool everyone together for that hour, you have tremendous, tremendous reach. You can also change medicine through social media. The American Diabetes Association, their meeting is now larger than the ACC. I think they have about 15,000 to 16,000 people. They had prohibited, as you see here, taking pictures of slides at the meetings. And they asked people to delete the content. And I thought this was horrible, so I mounted a movement which was stop deleting, start tweeting. And 60 million impressions later, 1 year later, the ADA said, oops, you can now change things and take pictures at the meetings and distribute that content. So even societies are learning that it's in their best interest to disseminate things broadly. People have said the quality is no good. It's not peer-reviewed. What could be more peer-reviewed than having everyone around the world look at the content? The other day, many of you may have seen a publication that said the CRISPR babies face a 20% shortened lifespan based upon some data from the UK Biobank. But my son called me, he said he didn't believe it. And then within 24 hours, here on the right, you see someone had gone and analyzed the UK Biobank data and shown that that wasn't the case. So really, there is quite good peer review on Twitter. And actually, I know of 3 articles in the past couple of months that have been withdrawn because of this kind of peer review. So again, we've moved from trials to multi-centered trials to mega trials. Let's now talk about giga trials. For instance, you will hear about the Apple Heart study, an observational study of 450,000 people. I'm now leading a trial of 180,000 people in a randomized trial with harder endpoints. So the old world, things were somewhat underpowered. You hoped you could definitively test the hypothesis, but in the new world, things will be very well powered. You'll really definitively test the hypothesis, and you should have plenty of power to test secondary hypotheses. In the old studies, you remember Courage, a trial like that, 4% of the people qualified. In the new world, you'll have a much broader net. It'll be real world, which has poor specificity, but much greater sensitivity. And at the end of the day, these newer gigatrials will have much broader generalizability. Many of us made a business of adjudicating events. This was the economic drivers of AROs. But now we'll be moving to using the ICD-10 codes from around the world to determine if someone had an MI. Now this will be much more sensitive, but it may be much less specific, and there are trade-offs. In the old days, if a trial was positive, well, you could probably bet it was clinically significant because the difference would have to be pretty big. But in the new trials, the gigatrials, they're so large that you could have a statistically significant result that may not be clinically significant. I think one of the biggest changes is this: eliminating bricks and mortar. Trials used to be hospital-based, now they are virtual. Patients used to be enrolled in the hospital, they will be, for chronic diseases, enrolled using an app. People were followed up in the past in the clinic, they still will be. But really, people are doing patient-assessed outcomes now online through apps. And in the old days, obviously the doctor and the nurse reported those outcomes. But in the New World Order, in the gigatrials, the patients will be reporting through patient-reported outcomes, both usual outcomes, but quality of life and health economic outcomes as well. One of the benefits of trials was improved compliance. You had a nurse looking over things, a doctor, those calls urged people to be compliant. That's great, but it's not really real world. And in the gigatrials, there will be much less oversight, and the results will probably more closely approximate what would happen in real world practice. Those of us who do large international megatrials know that when we get to top speed, we can enroll about 1,000 patients a month. But in gigatrials, we will be enrolling tens of thousands of patients each month. Probably the biggest advance is this: cost. It costs about $1.1 to $1.2 billion to do some of the current ongoing studies, $20,000 to $50,000 per patient. Cost to track down a patient who goes missing is $50,000. 40% of the budget is spent on monitoring, sending people out to verify things. In the new gigatrials, the costs will be dramatically reduced. Even though they're much bigger, the budget will be a fraction of what it used to be. There's no cost to tracking down those patients because everyone in the United States, if they're over 65, is in the CMS database. With kind of smart monitoring or monitoring at risk, you can dramatically reduce the budget. Obviously, we've moved from paper to electronic. We've moved from institutional-specific IRB approvals to global centralized IRB approvals to streamline the process as well. And the way you get randomized will be on an app now. So doctors and nurses were reimbursed in the past as part of the AROs, but now patients will be paid for their efforts and their times, which is a dramatic change. This has been vetted by a lot of attorneys. It does not represent an inducement to participate from a legal perspective, but that's a dramatic change as well. Safety reporting, very complex process in the past, lots of things submitted, translated, vetted, adjudicated, queries. Now, with the use of the ICD-10 codes, you get it right at discharge, and we'll be following the safety on an ongoing basis. And finally, patient access to data. Only the doctor and the nurse knew in the past. Now all the data will be on the app, and the patient can review what's going on with them. To kind of come full circle, there will now be social media or social networking as part of the trials. If your relative has an MI, or if they have something going on their Apple Watch, for instance, the family members will be alerted to that to help participate in their care. It takes lots of data, big amounts of data to do big data, and gigatrials will give us that data. There won't be as many covariates, but there will be many more patients. So it'll be data-rich, patient-rich, somewhat data poor, but we should learn a lot. This brings me to what we'll be doing. We're doing a large trial of 180,000 people, randomized, looking at stroke, rates and MI rates and systemic embolization rates. These are major health problems. We'll be randomizing people to an Apple Watch or no Apple Watch, and then we'll see if that watch, when paired with an app, if it really improves heart outcomes, things like cardiovascular death, MI, stroke, TIA, systemic embolization. We should be adequately powered to address that issue. Now, I know you'll hear from Mentu and Kin that the rates of AFib detection were low in their trial, but we're just studying people over 65, where there should be much higher rates of atrial fibrillation. So there are perils to the New World Order, but I think the benefits greatly outweigh those perils. It's really exciting to be participating in this New World Order. I hope all of you will join us in conducting these giga trials. Thanks for having me here today.